To see the grid, look up first, because the sky is the switch. Start at Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years in the rearview, where ritual didn't wait for farming to show up, it scheduled it. The enclosures sit like open clocks. Pillars face not random horizons, but stable cues. On pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, carved symbols cluster with a discipline that isn't storytelling, it's bookkeeping. Recent interpretations propose those V-shapes may encode counts in a lunisolar rhythm, with possible catch-up marks to reconcile lunar and solar cycles. This remains debated but testable under alignment tolerances. If that holds, you're looking at a schedule engine older than writing. Here's why that matters. When you can call the day, you can call the people. A beam of first light crossing a marker isn't poetry, it's a bell. It says, gather here, bring grain, bring hands, bring offerings. And at Göbekli's sister site, Karahan Tepe includes an elongated pillared pool, interpreted by some as ritual architecture, that echoes the region's shared design language and possible calendrical practice. Meanwhile, radiating out from the structures, you don't see neat villages. You see a labor theater, the place where time told bodies where to be. Ritual first, agriculture after, a calendar before a city. Shift northwest to Ireland to a green mound that behaves like a circuit. Newgrange looks like a tomb until the year turns. On winter solstice mornings, a thin sun slips through a little box over the entrance and threads a 20-meter passage to strike the chamber floor. That beam isn't forgiving. Miss your azimuth by a degree and it dies on stone. Hit it and the whole space blooms. That repeatability, the same few minutes, the same tight tolerance, announces year zero. Reset the count. Start the schedule. Communities don't need a central clock when a hill does it for them every year without fail. Cross an ocean and millennia forward, the logic scales. Chanquillo on Peru's coast set 13 stone towers along a ridge. Stand at either observation point and watch the sun's rise bounce along those teeth across the seasons. It's a horizon machine, the date told by which gap ignites at dawn. No intercontinental phone calls, no priest whisper network, just a public instrument everyone can see. South of the Sahara at Nabta Playa, stone circles and aligners in a dried lake bed track solstices and stellar risings. Another node, same behavior, time measured on the horizon, consumed as social order. What nobody knew at the time was how much of that sky logic would end up in brass. When the Antikythera mechanism surfaced from a Greek wreck, corroded and stubborn, CT scans decades later pulled schedules from its teeth. Eclipses predicted, festival dates keyed to city calendars, cycles nested so citizens could sync their lives. Recent readings sharpen that picture even more. It wasn't just astronomy, it was administration. A dial that tells you when to process, when to sacrifice, when to convene. Mechanical time made portable. Now remember, pattern without constraint is a trap. So test the sky grid by what repeats and how tight. Solstice azimuths don't drift much over human lifetimes, they're invariants. At Göbekli, Newgrange, Chanquillo, and Nabta, you see builders anchoring stones to those fixed angles. Then check tolerances. How close is the aperture to the sun's true path? Newgrange's beam tolerances are razor-thin. Chanquillo's tower spacing preserves date resolution across the year. Nabta's aligners hold within margins that beat chance. Add the Antikythera's dial logic, eclipse cycles married to civic festivals, and the pattern passes the geometry test. One sky, multiple instruments, same use case. Meanwhile, something else was happening beneath those horizons. Water. Sites with precise solar signatures often sit on hydrologic edges, floodplains, basins, springs. Newgrange overlooks a river valley, Nabta's circles ring a vanished lake, Göbekli's plateau dominates seasonal routes to water. That's not mystical, it's logistics. Time controls when water moves, when fields drink, when reservoirs fill. A calendar beam in a chamber is also a pump switch in stone. Here's where the stakes sharpen. Whoever keeps the calendar controls labor. Plant here, harvest there, haul stone now. Calendars become payrolls when they set feast days, tax days, and mobilization days. Priests become schedulers. Enclosures become terminals. At Angkor, where we'll go later, the monsoon owns the clock. The city learns to listen with reservoirs and canals. But the habit starts here. Sky time encoded in architecture so tightly you can run a society off it. There's a counter move worth hearing. Couldn't these be coincidences? Pretty sunsets, human imagination? Maybe, until you layer them. Take solstice azimuths, cross-check with apertures that admit minutes-long beams, add horizon markers that resolve to specific days, then tie those to festivals in a mechanism with inscriptions that name the civic use. That stack isn't a face in a cloud, it's a specification. And once a region learns that trick, the grid grows. Distributed timekeeping nodes, hill, ridge, lake bed, temple act like synchronized beacons. A farmer doesn't ask a king what day it is, he watches the ridge. A crew chief doesn't need a messenger, she feels the sun slide into the slot and shouts. Meanwhile, scribes learn to freeze those rhythms into tablets and rules. Ritual becomes schedule, schedule becomes surplus, surplus becomes stone. Back at Göbekli, step into the wind and see the biggest reveal. Those carved animals and V-marks aren't just stories. They're the annotation layer on a living instrument. Early people weren't lost in a mythic haze. They were calibrating publicly with rock and light. The grid starts with that humility. Anchor to the sky, then let the sky govern the ground. Once you can switch the calendar, you can switch the people into building. The stone spine load, lift, and line. Once the sky sets the schedule, stone turns it into throughput. Start where the voids made headlines. At Giza, Muon Imaging didn't hand us treasure, it handed us circulation. A long cavity above the Grand Gallery, a corridor tucked behind chevrons near the north face, features that look less like secret rooms and more like pathways. Think scaffolding frozen inside the monument. Move stone up a spine, divert, relieve, stage, return. If the pyramid is a machine, these are the ducts. Pressure relief for weight, yes, but also lanes for crews, sledges, and counterweights to pass without collision. We keep wanting a single-purpose box. The scans keep sketching a warehouse. Crew marks in nearby quarries read like shift notes. Harbor basins along the inundation edge record seasonal deliveries when the Nile rises, then recedes. Water delivering limestone to ramps, ramps feeding galleries, galleries feeding lifts. Meanwhile, outside the stone shell, workmen's villages organize around bakeries and breweries sized for armies. Monuments don't sit on nothing, they sit on provisioning. The tomb functions when the kitchen hums. Now turn east to Angkor, where the backbone is visible from the sky. LIDAR stripped the forest and revealed a rational city welded to water math. Orthogonal grids, embanked roads, barracks the size of lakes, feeder canals stepping down like gears. The temple isn't a standalone jewel. It's a capstone on a hydraulic cascade that breathes with the monsoon. When rains come hard, channels split and buffer flow. When they fail, reservoirs stretch seasons. That's smoothing, not spectacle. And yet, as the climate flickers, the grid strains. Silt clogs, berms breach, and the whole system reveals its edge case. Too much order locks you to yesterday's water. Swing south to the Andes, where gravity runs the show. Machu Picchu looks perched for drama. It's seated for resilience. Terraces aren't scenic steps, they're engineered soils, retaining walls, drainable layers, stone vents that wick away slope water before it shears the mountain. Channels thread through stairs so foot traffic and flow never argue. Up top, springs are captured, split, and sequenced so the sacred fountain doesn't starve the kitchens. Inca ashlar isn't smug perfection, it's seismic logic. Joints interlock to ride waves. Cracks choose harmless paths. The stone remembers earthquakes and quietly refuses to fall. Cross a continent to Cahokia, where stone gives way to earth but the ledger remains. Mounds rise in ranks. Plazas flatten into calendars for assembly. The skyline is dirt, yet it organizes surplus like any royal quarter. Surrounding fields feed storage. Elevated platforms carry ritual and rule where eyes can count the bodies and cheeks can feel the speaker's schedule. Trade routes spill in copper, shells, mica. The artifacts of a supply web measured in weeks and seasons, not miles and myths. When floods shift and droughts bite, the skyline blinks, earthworks expand, then halt, like a heartbeat hitting in a rhythmic run. The pattern test isn't aesthetic, it's accounting. Do the biggest stones sit atop the fattest provision lines? At Giza, harbor to ramp to gallery reads like a conveyor. At Angkor, barre to canal to field to temple forms a loop with shock absorbers. At Machu Picchu, terrace to channel to fountain to reservoir routes water and load through stacked programs. At Cahokia, mound to plaza to warehouse ties ceremony to storage. The monument is never the system. It's the terminal where the system announces itself. We gloss over that because we crave singular genius. But organization beats tools. Göbekli's pillars rose pre-metal because schedules recruit hands and choreography turns hands into levers. Egyptian quarries spit blocks because barges hit at flood crest and teams knew their slots. Khmer sandstones flew because canal gradients were tuned to seasons, not wishes. Inca blocks seeded because training taught crews to listen for a stone's pitch when it kissed its neighbor. You don't need lost tech when you have a spine and a metronome. What nobody knew at the time was how modern scans would make the invisible nerves pop. Muon see voids, but also the absence that logistics leave. Lanes, staging pockets, pressure chambers. LIDAR shows canals and embankments that planners drew with straightedges of mud. Drone photogrammetry maps terrace curvature that keeps soil alive while it carries crops like a conveyor belt. Layer these and the monuments stop being puzzles and start reading like process diagrams. Here's the stakes moment. If these structures are terminals on throughput systems, then collapse isn't a mystery cult ending. It's a supply chain failure. Angkor's grid couldn't forgive a shifting monsoon. Cahokia's fields couldn't outrun a wet, dry whip. Giza's machine froze into symbol when the Nile's rhythms and political schedules decoupled. Machu Picchu endured as a microgrid while the macro state unraveled, resilience at one scale, failure at another. The spine works until the pulses it rides move out from under it. There's a temptation to romanticize ruins as the work of a vanished elect. The receipts say otherwise. The difference between wonder and hub is maintenance. Dredge the canal, rebuild the berm, resurface the ramp. Retune the calendar to the sky you actually have, not the one priests promised. When elites stop paying for upkeep, or when the sky refuses to honor last year's chart, stone becomes heavy again. Terminals go dark. Which brings us back to the grid's promise and its trap. Build a spine and you can move mountains with people. Freeze it too tightly to a climate, a river, or a ritual, and it snaps when the input changes. That's not ancient tragedy. That's systems engineering running into the real world. Up next, how those spines connect. Sea roads and star roads, the lines that carry materials, messages, and power between terminals. The movement network, sea roads, star roads. While the spine pumped, the nerves stretched. Movement is where a grid stops being local luck and turns into policy. Start underwater where a ship sank and kept its manifest like a confession. Off Turkey's coast, the Uluburun cargo stacked metal like a balance sheet. 10 tons of copper oxide ingots, tin from far away, glass, resins, ivory ostrich eggshells, carved luxury. That's not random trade, that's standardized packaging and planned routes. Ingots cast in shapes crews recognized by touch. Amphory sized for counting. Everything about it says repeat legs, known stops, protected handoffs. A Bronze Age showroom headed to buyers who already knew the catalog. Meanwhile, another wreck near Antikythera carried bronze and marble bodies, exquisite and heavy, plus that gearwork brain we already met. That ship wasn't smuggling trinkets. It was moving prestige and technology together. Art tech bundles for elites with synchronized calendars. You don't ship a mechanism that schedules festivals without expecting city clocks to read it on arrival. Even protection looks systematic. Reports of arms on board imply planned defense for planned value. A route like that needs predictability. Sailing windows, anchorages, wind habits logged and shared. On land's roughest roof, the Incas stitched peaks into a supply chain. The Q-Hapak Nyan wasn't a line. It was a fabric, stone-paved trunk roads, high passes with retaining walls, stairways cut into cliff, rope, bridges humming in gorges. Way stations, tambos, held food, blankets, weapons. Relay runners, chasquis, carried knots of data on kippis and baskets of perishables across distances that flatten ordinary bureaucracies. Administrative checkpoints didn't just tax, they synchronized pulses, who moves when, who rests where, how many mouths the next storehouse must feed. In mountains, distance is measured in breath, not miles. The state learned to count breaths. Back to water where coasts think like roads. The Nile to Levant littoral is a ladder of bays, capes, and cities spaced by time, safe day sails, predictable landfalls, freshwater markers. The monsoon routes of the Indian Ocean add a seasonal switch. Winds flip, fleets flip with them. Outbound with the southwest, inbound with the northeast. Ports tune their calendars to those winds. Festivals and market fairs clustered around arrivals. Warehouses filled and emptied in rhythm with the sky. A sail isn't a map, it's an appointment book. Across the biggest water of all, Polynesian wayfinders solved a geometry most people still can't do without screens. They rode swell memory, star paths, bird flights, and cloud shadows to plot long runs to specks like Rapa Nui. That's not guesswork, that's lived mathematics. Consistent bearings tracked night after night, distances measured in songs and heartbeats, islands encoded in constellations and low-light signatures. Canoes became instruments. Crews became algorithms. Landfall was a proof, not a surprise. If you need the bureaucracy behind the poetry, a muddy fort near a stone wall in Britain keeps receipts on wood. At Vindolanda, ink on wafer-thin tablets lists socks, sandals, cloaks, beer counts, unit strength, and deliveries due. Not glamorous, but it's the connective tissue of power, requisitions, entitlements, and reminders. When a road meets a tablet, a state appears. When a shipment misses its line, a state bleeds. Here's the pattern test for movement. Do we see repeated legs, standardized leagues, house declination, consistent compass bias embedded in navigational habits? We do. Mediterranean Portland charts web the sea in 32 bearings, their rum lines preserving a magnetic frame. Pilots change short, known hops into long arcs that hold shape when you average distance and align to the same tilt. In the Andes, way stations fall into day intervals sized to terrain, not fantasy. In the Indian Ocean, sailing calendars turn monsoons into timetables. Movement nodes cluster where monument clusters do, harbors at river mouths, passes below storied peaks, desert oases capped by ritual sites. The grid's lines aren't painted, they're worn into water and earth by schedules. What nobody knew at the time was how those patterns would multiply when measured. Cartometric tests on early charts show repeated compression along parallels and steady rotations across coasts, fingerprints of shop doctrine. Survey of Inca Tambo's lands in predictable day bands across provinces. Cargo types on Rex Echo lists from palaces. The river to sea, the pass to plaza, it's all one circulation plan executed in different materials. Stakes, movement determines who eats, who profits, who governs. Control the channels and you mint loyalty. Lose a node and lines rearrange without asking permission. When Uluburan went down, it wasn't just metal at the bottom. It was a snapshot of risk in a network held together by trust and timing. When the monsoon drifted, ports fell behind before priests could rewrite festival days. When a bridge snapped on the Hapak Nyan, a province starved 2 valleys over. Grids fail fast along the lines they built strongest. This is why myth grows on roots. Stories hide timetables inside gods and beasts. Songlines in the Pacific are maps with alibis. Caravan tales cross the Sahara with waypoints disguised as epics. The romance isn't fake, it's a privacy layer. The real secret is boring. Departures at dawn, arrivals at dusk, loads tallied, seasons watched. A civilization is its calendar, its spine, and its roads. Remove one and the others turn into ornaments. The geometry test, alignments under constraint. Okay, time to stop admiring lines and start testing them. The rule is simple and brutal. One rotation, one scale, anchor on invariance. No rubber sheet stretching, no massaging corners until they behave. If a pattern's real, it survives discipline. Start with the Cartometric rulebook. Pick a coastline or a temple field. Identify anchors that don't lie, solstice azimuths, cardinal foundations, capes that stand for centuries, capstones that were set to sit. Then apply a rigid transform. Rotate once to account for magnetic habit or layout bias, scale once to correct shop leagues or survey compression, and test residuals. If long arcs settle while errors cluster at known weak coverage edges, you've got a spine. If the fit requires local bending, you've got a story, not a system. Maps first, because ink hid the grid in plain sight. The Piri Reis fragment South America mid-latitudes behave like someone averaged multiple legs inside a crown office. Run the rigid fit from Bahia through Cabo Frio and down toward the Plata. A single rotation consistent with early 16th century declination stabilizes bearings. A single uniform scale collapses the east-west squeeze. Intercape distances hold proportion better than artistry alone can fake. Residuals spike where they should, at the Amazon bulge and deep south, right where survey density thinned. That's not miracle cartography. That's standardized leagues plus house correction surfacing through a copy. Cross-lineage echoes matter. Portuguese and Spanish planispheres from the 152s show the same tilt and compression along the same bands. Later Ottoman tracings preserve it too. When independent workshops repeat identical bias on the same stretch, you're looking at doctrine, not coincidence. That's geometry carrying a shop style, rotation band, parallel squeeze, estuary exaggeration ratios, across borders like a watermark. Now land the test on the ground. Solstice azimuths are invariants you can hang stone on. Newgrange's roof box admits a beam for minutes on winter solstice, tight tolerance, repeatable year after year. Chanquillo's 13 towers resolve the sun's march into daily teeth. Observation points fix a calendar on the horizon with date resolution you can measure. Nabta Playa's aligners sit within margins that beat chance and match solstitial and stellar targets. When you overlay site axes against expected azimuths, one rotation to correct local topography and measurement frame is enough. No warping. The beam still threads the passage. Cities behave too. At Angkor, LIDAR pulled a rectilinear hydrology out of jungle, orthogonal embankments, feeder canals, barre edges that meet like drafted lines. Take a slice and fit the grid orientation with one rotation. Bearings cluster around consistent axes. Offsets fall into stepwise bands tied to levee heights and flow management. It's not speculative symmetry. It's water math executed in dirt with a ruler. Back to Egypt because stone tolerances love constraints. The Great Pyramid's base sides deviate from true cardinal directions by mere minutes of arc. That's not supernatural, that's surveying discipline. The chevron-backed corridor on the north face, imaged by muons and optics, tracks a rational internal layout, relieving pressure, yes, but also preserving consistent pathways. Model the likely internal lanes with a single orientation and staging intervals sized to crew throughput, and voids land where process wants them. Logistics leaves negative space with a pattern. Here S where we draw a bright line. Terra Australis fantasies fail the constraint test. If you take a southern skirt and try to force it to Antarctica under one rotation and one scale, promontory spacing fails and gulf widths drift. Toss it. Meanwhile, mid-latitude spines stabilize with the same transform. Keep those. The test isn't designed to embarrass myths, it's designed to reward coherence. The water grid passes in a different way. At Angkor, Barre edges a line with channel axes. Fields slot orthogonally into distribution lanes. Where the monsoon slams hardest, you see thicker embankments, load mapping written as width. At Machu Picchu, terrace faces follow curvature that drains at predictable rates. Stair channels align with fall lines. Spring conduits step down in pressure-friendly increments. Fit these with a single site rotation and proportional scaling by slope, and functional lines stack. It's infrastructure geometry, not decoration. If you need one more cross-pillar payoff, stack horizon instruments with provisioning terminals. Newgrange's Solstice Q sits above a river valley with arable terraces aligned to embankments. Chanquillo's towers overlook pathways and walls that manage access. Nabta's circles rim a paleo lake, timing and water fused. The Antikythera's festival dial locks civic pulse to sky, while trade ships, Uluburan Antikythera, carry standardized cargo along predictable legs. When sky, stone, and sea all keep time in the same frame, you don't have vibes, you have a grid. Impact, constraints cut through romance and excuses. They show where method lives. A single rotation and scale stabilizing hundreds of miles says office doctrine. A solstice beam landing within minutes for centuries says calibration culture. Orthogonal waterworks sustaining a capital for generations says civil engineering, not miracles. And together they say the same thing. Where time, load, and movement overlap under constraint, infrastructure appears. Everything was about to change when we asked one last question.